Hey guys, weary traveler, and welcome to this cozy corner of history. Tonight, we'll dive into a world completely opposite of what Hollywood shows us about assassins, those cool, glamorous figures. The truth is nothing but bleak and dangerous. Before we begin our journey back in time, I really want to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Isn't it amazing that across all the time zones, nations and cultures, we get to meet here together to explore the mysteries of history? So, if you share the same passion for these stories, feel free to leave a comment, share where you're from, and tell me how you feel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly feel this journey is worth it. Now, turn off the lights, sink into the quiet, and let's begin. No child in medieval Europe ever grew up dreaming of becoming an assassin. When parents asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" the common answers were, a farmer-like father, a blacksmith-like uncle, or, for the dreamers, a brave knight saving a princess. No one ever said, "I want to cut a bishop's throat for 12 silver coins and end up hanging in the marketplace." Being an assassin wasn't a profession. There was no career path, no apprenticeship, no certificates on the wall, no guild protecting your rights. It was like the last carriage of life's train where everyone crushed by society eventually fell. Most assassins of the Middle Ages weren't mysterious masters trained in mountaintop monasteries, nor were they hooded heroes like in today's movies. They were society's failures, landless peasants, harvests ruined, drought, or simply a lord seizing their fields. Hungry and bitter, they left their villages. Deserters, endless wars, kings pushing armies to fight. Those who fled the battlefield, if not executed, drifted into mercenary life and slid further into murder for hire. Failed thieves, petty theft no longer fed them, betrayed by comrades, chased away from markets until someone tapped their shoulder and whispered, "There's a job, more profitable." Outcasts, deformed, heretics, or simply people no one cared about if they vanished. Even census lists didn't bother to record them. They didn't choose this life. They were forced into it. When every other door slammed shut, killing dangerous, filthy, and uncertain became the only road left. Picture this. You just got out of prison for stealing chickens. You're starving, filthy, and no one hires a man who once wore chains. You try to find work hauling loads, rejected. You try at a monastery, mocked. Finally, in a dim tavern, a stranger slides a purse across the table and whispers a name. You know, one nod, and you step into a world where blood and silver trade places. But you also know, if you refuse, you'll starve in a ditch. What choice do you really have? It's not about wanting, it's about having no choice. In medieval times, knights had honor, priests had God, merchants had gold, and assassins, nothing except murmurs in taverns. That one's dangerous. No statues raised, no poems sung. On the contrary, if you got too good, the faster they'd hang you on the city gate as a warning. You could shake a kingdom with one stab, but history would never record your name. At best, people gave you vague nicknames: the Shadow, the Cloaked One, the Stranger. At worst, you were erased, left dangling with a wooden sign: hired, killer cursed. Your world held no glory, only dreadful silence and distant curses. An assassin could never belong anywhere. In the countryside, peasants would stone you and set dogs loose if they smelled blood on your hands. In cities, merchants would avoid your eyes as if avoiding the plague. In taverns, you always sat in the darkest corner, back against the wall, eyes fixed on the door. You couldn't have friends. They'd ask, "Why do your hands always tremble?" Or, "Why do you only appear at night?" You couldn't have love. Love meant revealing your identity, and that was a death sentence. You existed as a nameless shadow, hiding in alleys, leaving behind only revolted whispers. People imagine assassins were well paid. Reality, very different. You could risk your life killing a lord, but when you came back for the money, your employer had already fled, or worse, hired someone else to kill you. Even if you were paid, it was never enough. A handful of coins couldn't pay for nights of nightmares, or 3 days hiding in flea-ridden straw waiting for the moment. That's why assassins never got rich. They just survived a little longer, their purse clinking with coins that dragged them into yet another job, dirtier, riskier. If you were a blacksmith, you could teach your son. If you were a soldier, You could return to your village as a hero. But an assassin, what could you pass on? Nothing. No apprentices, no traditions. Each one lived for a few contracts and vanished. No face remembered, no name preserved. They died in silence, and their deaths were celebrated. The killer has been punished. This trade never created a future. It only led straight to the graveyard. Perhaps the greatest tragedy was this. Assassins never began as assassins. They were once ordinary people, a father, a husband, a young soldier, a girl accused of witchcraft. But society crushed them, pushed them aside, and when they had nothing left to lose, they took the purse sliding across the table. That moment agreeing to kill wasn't one of courage. It was one of utter despair, like a drowning man clutching a rotten branch knowing it would break. Modern culture loves to romanticize assassins, cloaked figures gliding through the night, acting like legends. The medieval reality, they were filthy, hungry, trembling, always expecting betrayal. No, moonlight gleamed on their blades, no epic music played. Only the sound of growling stomachs, barking dogs in the distance, and the rusty smell of blood on cracked hands. Assassins were never anyone's first choice. They were the final fall, when a human being was pushed to the very bottom, with nothing left but desperation. There were no schools teaching the art of assassination, no manuals with careful steps on how to stab cleanly without staining the palace carpet. No master shouting, "All right, class, today we'll learn how to kill a baron without letting him scream." Their entire training boiled down to one rule: survive the first job, then learn from mistakes that should have killed you. No shiny weapons or sturdy armor, just a rusty dagger scavenged from a drunk soldier's corpse and a trembling, conflicted mind. The first lesson came as they crept into a damp alley, heart pounding, clutching a dull blade, wondering, "Am I sure I won't cut myself instead?" No one taught them how to step without squeaky shoes on wet stone. No one told them a sneeze at the wrong time could kill faster than a guard's sword. No class explained how to tell a noble's bedroom from a servant's until you woke the wrong person screaming for guards. That was the training. Trial, error, survival, repeat. If you were lucky enough to be a former soldier, you knew a bit about holding a blade, striking with your hand's edge, or holding your breath crawling through trenches. But most of them, their first attempts looked like clumsy theatre. A stab missing the ribs, tumbling into a coal bucket, or sprinting through a marketplace while tripping over chickens, exposing themselves to everyone. No books, no guidance. Everything written in blood, sometimes their own. The lucky ones called it experience. The unlucky, they became punchlines for guards retelling at taverns. Some idiot tried to kill the tax collector and ended up stabbing himself in the leg. What people called an assassin's skill was really the art of turning failure into lessons. Fell off a rooftop? Next time, pick one less slippery. Dogs barking? Bring rotten meat to distract them. Killed the wrong man? At least now you know the real target sleeps in the guarded room, not the broom closet. Their training ground wasn't a classroom, but the villages, castles, and dark alleys where they stumbled along. No notebooks, only scars. A cut cheek from a broken window, a crooked finger from a rusty hinge, nightmares of the wide eyes of someone they failed to kill. There was no secret dojo to welcome you. If there was, it was just a gang of hardened thugs who, when in the mood, would pass down a few half-baked tricks. An old thief might show you how to step across creaking floorboards without a sound, but he could also sell you out the very next day for a hot meal. A washed-up mercenary might teach you how to spin a knife quicker, but he'd always remind you, don't trust anyone, not even me. Poison, the thing legends love to tie to assassins, was taught the same way. Trial and error until somebody died, or until you were the one who died first. Pick the wrong handful of leaves, and you'd be vomiting for 3 days. Mistake the wrong mineral, and your lungs would burn until you suffocated. There was no laboratory for safe experiments, only a dark kitchen, a smoky pot of stew, and a desperate prayer that the victim drank the wrong cup, not you. At least soldiers had commands to follow. Assassins had nothing but survival instincts. That's what taught them to hold their breath at the sound of armor clinking in the hallway. That's what taught them to count the guards' footsteps in their heads, waiting for the tiny gap to slip through. That's what taught them never to trust silence, because silence meant a trap. Their student was fear. Their teacher was death, always breathing down their neck. And the only test: complete the mission without leaving your own corpse in a pool of blood. Bit by bit, after brushes with capture, they got smarter. They learned to use shadows, to walk in rhythm with church bells to hide their footsteps, to disguise themselves as beggars on a street corner so they could watch unnoticed. But none of those skills came from books. They came from a long chain of near-death experiences. One assassin once said, "I learned to climb the city wall after falling 7 times, breaking 3 bones, and finally figuring out the right posture so I wouldn't snap my neck." Another admitted, "The first lesson in poison is never drink on an empty stomach, otherwise your guts twist so bad you can't even walk to your target." Every assassin was a school unto himself. No graduates, no diplomas. Instead, their lessons were written in scars, in broken teeth, in the panic that flashed across their eyes when they remembered the time a blade missed and almost ended their own life. If there was a graduation, it was the first time they succeeded, a body collapsing without a scream, a night's escape without a guard noticing. But even then, graduation wasn't glorious. No trophies, no cheering crowd, only trembling in the dark, sweat dripping down their back, and a blood-stained pouch of silver coins. This trade didn't train mystical masters. It just threw people into a pit and said, "If you climb out, you've learned enough." Rusty knives. That's right, that was the primary weapon of most medieval assassins. Not gleaming swords etched with artistry like in the stories, but kitchen knives once used to butcher pigs, edges chipped, tossed aside. If they were luckier, they found a dagger from a battlefield abandoned because it was too dull, or crusted with dried blood nobody wanted to touch. Knives weren't sharpened in forges. They were wiped hastily on a sleeve, with the hope they'd cut through. A thick wool tunic. Some poor souls even tested the blade on their own thigh just to make sure it still bit into flesh. Rust meant wounds easily got infected. Sounds useful, right? Stab them, let them rot. But reality was crueler. Unless you hit a vital spot, the victim might survive long enough to scream and call the guards. And what good was a slow, festering death weeks later if you'd already been hanged? The rusty knife was both companion and betrayer, always threatening to ruin the job. Then came rope. Sounds versatile. Strangle, climb, bind. But medieval rope was rough hemp, sticky with resin, stiff as a whip. Wrap it around your hands and it cut into your skin. Pull it around a neck, and it didn't choke clean. It screeched like a saw cutting wood, loud enough for guards to come running. And climbing a wall? Try it on a rainy night when the rope slips, and you crash into a pile of horse manure below. That was the reality of this so-called professional tool. Sometimes, a hopeful assassin thought of setting traps with rope. But where? In a cramped city street, the first old woman tripping over it with her vegetable basket would alert the whole neighborhood. In a palace? Worse. The guards would laugh, cut the rope, and hang you upside down at the gate like a pig waiting for slaughter. And then there was poison, the most romantic image people later gave to assassins. Folks imagine a few drops of some mysterious liquid in a goblet of wine, and the victim slumping dead in seconds. The reality? Chaotic and filthy. Medieval poison was brewed from mold, strange roots, toxic minerals, sometimes even dried toad guts or rat livers. No standard doses, no manuals. Add a pinch of leaves, the victim vomits all night and survives. Add too much, and you inhale the fumes and keel over in the kitchen yourself. The only guideline? Pray. Even if you brewed it right, how do you get it into a lord's mouth? Nobles had 3 tasters, plus a dog. If the dog collapsed, the feast was over, the cook executed, and you, the suspicious stranger nearby, were first on the chopping block. Poison wasn't some elegant weapon. It was a one-way ticket to the gallows. That's why so many chose the rusty knife over the boiling pot of poison. Sometimes they improvised weapons, half tool, half joke. One desperate soul used roof tiles. Pry one loose, wait for the target, drop it. Sounds cinematic. In reality, it shattered on the stone street. The target looked up, and you were caught. Another shoved a rusty nail in his shoe to jab a guard's ankle. The result? The guard screamed, and the whole garrison woke up. Often, assassins' weapons were just household tools. A garlic pestle, a stone hammer, or an iron boot buckle. Not out of creativity, but because they couldn't get near an armory. Every object hidden under their cloak was a risk. Would it clank as they walked? Would it fall out just as they bowed to a soldier? And if caught, how do you explain carrying an iron spike in your clothes? There was no excuse that could save you. Medieval assassins weren't allowed to carry big weapons. A two-handed sword or a long spear would only make them stand out. Instead, they had to rely on things small, cheap, and easy to hide, though just as easy to break, to dull, or to backfire. These tools didn't make them feel powerful. They only reminded the wielder that every job was a gamble, and their weapon wasn't much better than a rusty spoon. The irony was, weapons didn't decide success or failure. What decided it was speed and silence. A dull knife could still finish the job, as long as the hand holding it was fast and steady. A frayed rope could still strangle a bishop, as long as the assassin had enough patience. A bowl of poisoned soup could still kill a lord, as long as he was too hungry to wait for a taster. But in every one of those cases, the victim's death often came with the risk of the assassin being exposed. And once exposed, those crude tools were worthless against 10 guards with steel spears. The knife snapped in half, the rope got cut, the poison failed. You ran, stumbled, and realized the only weapon left was your trembling legs. Those tools never carried any sense of glory. They only reminded the world that assassins weren't warriors. They didn't walk onto battlefields. They didn't fight fair duels. They were opportunists, exploiting tiny cracks in the darkness, armed with cheap, filthy tools. Every time they drew a blade, tossed a rope, or sprinkled powder, they were gambling with their lives, and the reward was often nothing more than a pouch of coins, barely enough to buy a round of ale. The people assassins were hired to kill were never the poor farmer carrying onions to the market, nor the drunk blacksmith passed out in an alley. Nobody paid to kill nobodies. Money only flowed when the target was important, and the more important they were, the harder they were to reach. Usually, that meant nobles behind fortress walls, bishops surrounded by clergy and guards, or generals who lived in circles of loyal men. A starving assassin, armed with nothing but a rusty blade and a few coins for a stable loft, had to face entire defense systems built on gold, power, and fear. It was such a lopsided game it bordered on absurd. On one side, a filthy, outcast loner. On the other, a castle with thick walls, iron gates, patrols, bloodthirsty hounds, and even moats filled with foul water and snapping fish. Picture a typical mission. Kill a baron. That baron never travelled alone. By day, he rode on horseback surrounded by shining armoured escorts, knights with lances, soldiers with shields, horns and drums clearing the way. By night, he slept behind 3 locked doors, in a chamber guarded by patrols, and dogs fed raw meat to keep them vicious. His windows barred with iron, and if you somehow slipped through, he had a bed tester, a servant who lay down, first to check if the sheets were poisoned. You weren't just trying to kill one man, you were trying to breach a living fortress. And bishops? That might sound easier, since the church wasn't an army. But the truth was worse. A bishop often travelled with an entourage like a moving carnival. Priests, servants, scribes, choirs, even children learning prayers. Each one of them a pair of eyes and ears. A strange glance, a misplaced step during Mass, a sneeze at the wrong time in the chapel and you were exposed. Not to mention bishops were often protected by devoted knights, men who believed dying for him was service to God. To kill a bishop meant facing not just guards, but blind faith itself, an invisible weapon more dangerous than any blade. Then there were the generals, men hardened by battle. Unlike nobles drunk on feasts or bishops buried in scriptures, generals knew how to protect themselves. They heard every creak in the dark. They chose beds, with their backs to the wall, swords within reach, guards always on watch. Attacking them was like charging a cornered beast. Their reaction so fast an assassin's shaky blade stood little chance. Every mission was a gamble you started with the losing hand. You had to watch for days, memorize every patrol shift, every creaking hinge, every guard rotation. One slip, 1/2 second too slow, and your plan collapsed. The castle's thick walls weren't just stone, they were reminders of how insane you were to think a rusty knife could shake the ruling class. Sometimes, the job wasn't even real, it was a political trap. A noble might spread word of wanting a bishop dead, just to bait enemies. The fool who took the job would walk straight into waiting guards, be captured alive, then executed in public. The crowd cheered while the noble clapped because that assassin had just served as a scapegoat, proof to the people that their masters were vigilant. Even when it wasn't a trap, the work was never easy. You had to slip into banquets where candlelight glowed, fiddles played, and dozens of suspicious eyes scanned every stranger. You had to force a smile, pose as a servant, bow before guards, hiding your sweating hands under a tray of wine. You knew, one clumsy step, one stare too long at a powerful man, and tomorrow your head would dangle at the city gate as a warning. The difficulty wasn't just the tight security, it was the crushing fear. You couldn't show emotion. You couldn't let your hands shake. You couldn't breathe too hard. And yet, sweat dripped down your neck, your heart pounded out of rhythm, and in your mind one question screamed, "Why did I take this job?" Too late to turn back. Retreat meant starving in the streets. Moving forward meant a chance, a slim one, to live a little longer. And the bitterest irony? Even success wasn't worth it. A pouch of coins, a few heavy pieces of silver in your palm, but the price was being hunted for life. Kill a noble, and his entire family would chase you down. Kill a bishop, and the church itself branded you a demon. Kill a general, and his soldiers swore vengeance. And yet, some still accepted it. Not out of ambition, not out of glory, but because they had nothing left to lose. Faced with the choice of slowly starving to death or risking it all on an impossible mission, they chose the second path. And every time they did, history recorded one more fleeting shadow, the shadow of someone reckless enough to strike at the untouchable, only to vanish without a trace. In the world of medieval assassins, the idea of allies existed only in hymns, where monks preached about brotherhood. Out in the real world, no one was foolish enough to shake hands with someone who might stab them in the back for a handful of coins. An assassin had no secret order, no guild to protect him, no brothers in arms. He was always alone, like a wolf cut off from the pack, wandering the dark forest, gnawing on scraps, waiting for the hunter's arrow to end him. And if someone did claim to be an ally, he was really just the dagger hidden under a cloak. Tonight, you drank together. Tomorrow, he sold you out to the guards in exchange for a lighter sentence in prison. Promises made in taverns only lasted until the silver coins slid across the table. Then, friendship dissolved like foam on beer, leaving only the bare truth. In this game, the only one you could trust was your own shadow, and sometimes, even your shadow betrayed you when the moonlight appeared. Honor. That was a luxury for knights on white horses, not for hired killers. A knight could die gloriously on the battlefield, his name etched into chronicles. A priest could fall at the altar and be declared a saint, but an assassin? No matter how many times he succeeded, he was only ever a cursed name. History didn't record him. Poetry didn't praise him. Even if he killed a tyrant, the people would never know his hand. The tyrant's death would be credited to God's will, divine punishment, or simply accident. The assassin was nothing more than a nameless shadow to be erased. The future of an assassin wasn't wealth, nor a peaceful old age by the fire. His future split into two roads, either hanging from a noose in the marketplace, or falling to another blade in the night. He lived without daring to think about tomorrow. He couldn't farm, couldn't open a shop, couldn't take a wife because anyone who knew his face could become a threat. The silver he earned only bought a few drunken nights, a few hot meals, and one more scar to remind him he was inching closer to the end. Failure meant public death. No one pitied a failed assassin. On the contrary, people relished it. When a killer for hire was caught, the entire village gathered in the square, as if for a festival. Children laughed and threw stones. Women pointed and cursed. Men drank beer, cheering for the execution to come. Hanging an assassin was society's way of proving justice existed, that anyone who dared challenge the order had to pay. And in that moment, the assassin's name was remembered not as a hero, but as entertainment for the crowd. But the irony was, even success didn't save them. Killing the target didn't mean freedom. Success only opened a new nightmare, hunted by the victim's family, chased by soldiers, and worst of all, betrayed by the very person who hired them. After all, what was easier for a scheming noble than erasing the witness to a murder he had ordered? A successful assassin was just a man holding a deadly secret, and that made him the next target. How many drank wine in celebration with their employer, only to collapse moments later because the wine had been poisoned? How many accepted a pouch of silver, only to find guards waiting outside the door? Their success, instead of being proof of their worth, was their death sentence. People only needed the assassin alive until the job was done. After that, his corpse was better off gone. No one trusted an assassin's loyalty, because assassins lived by betrayal. And so, when the work was complete, betrayal was inevitable. Maybe he was sold out, maybe cheated, maybe paid less than promised, but one thing was certain: he would never be honored. Those long nights on the run, always glancing over his shoulder, were the only glory an assassin ever earned. He couldn't stay in one city too long. Every tavern, every inn risked exposure. He couldn't trust strangers. Every smile might hide a blade. He couldn't rest because the moment he closed his eyes, the shadows of old enemies stalked him in his dreams. A life like that, with no allies, no honor, no future, was nothing more than a slow sentence. Assassins didn't just die once. They died little by little, in every anxious moment, in every suspicious glance, in every sleepless night. Success never saved them. It only delayed the next failure. And failure, as everyone knew, was the final, brutal public end. When a king died, the chronicles wrote the name of his killer. Statues were built, poems sung, whether in praise or in hatred. When a knight fell, his coat of arms was carved into stone, so his descendants could be proud. When a bishop died, his last words were recorded in holy scripture, passed down for generations. But when an assassin vanished, he scattered like dust in the wind. No name, no face, no history. No historian ever bothered to record a hired killer's name. If they did, it was only a vague line. A stranger slew the count. And that was it. Who was that stranger? What was his name? Where was he born? How did he grow up? No one cared. To society, he wasn't a person at all, but a tool, a walking blade, discarded as soon as the job was done. Even if he succeeded spectacularly killing a tyrant, shaking an entire court, the glory never belonged to him. History praised the noble who ordered it, or credited it to heaven's will. The assassin? He was an invisible gap, deliberately erased from the larger picture. The powerful feared his existence, because admitting his name meant admitting that the social order was so fragile and nobody could shatter it. And so, the only way to protect that order was to erase him, forever. They say, a tragic death is immortal. But assassins never had that privilege. When one was hanged in the square, the crowd might cheer, but the very next morning, his body was dumped in a common pit with beggars and thieves. No tombstone, no carved name, only bones rotting into the earth. If he had a family, they were cast out, forced to change their name, living in shame. They had no father, no husband, no son, only the disgrace that their blood once belonged to a killer for hire. Some assassins tried to leave a mark. One carved a symbol on the wall after every kill, hoping someday people would remember him. But once, caught, the guards scraped the carvings away, and his legacy was gone by sundown. Another left a final letter, detailing his deeds, hoping history would keep it. But those letters were burned as soon as the judge finished reading them, ashes drifting into the wind, leaving nothing but laughter behind. Assassins lived like ghosts, and they died like ghosts. They walked through the night, leaving a corpse behind, then vanished. A century later, people might remember the name of the one who was killed, the dynasty that collapsed, the war that erupted, but no one remembered the one who started it all. He was the shadow of a shadow, existing only to disappear. The bitterest truth was, the assassin himself knew it. He knew that every scar on his body, every near death, every trembling night spent on the run, none of it would ever be remembered. He knew he was nothing more than a fragment in the great machine of history, crushed without leaving a trace. And perhaps because of that, he stopped being afraid. Because if death was certain, if being forgotten was inevitable, then what was left to lose? The assassin's entire life was a paradox. He existed to erase others, but in the end, the one erased was himself. The powerful names he killed could live forever in the pages of history, but the man holding the blade was struck out by history's hand. He was like the eraser itself, wiping away ink from the page, wearing himself down until nothing remained. And that was the cruelest fate of a medieval assassin. No allies, no honor, no future, and not even memory left for posterity. A life condensed into a few stabs, a few coins, and finally, eternal silence. On the wild borderlands of Epirus, among untamed mountains and forests never carved by man, a girl was born into the royal Molossian bloodline. That was Olympias, a woman whose destiny was bound not only to the throne, but to ancient rituals where the line between human and divine blurred. Epirus was not glittering Macedonia with its chariots and armies, nor was it Athens full of philosophers and orators. Epirus was the land of priests, of sacred serpents, of prophecies whispered in the mountain winds. From childhood, Olympias lived in the air of ritual. She grew up among the smoke of altars, where women in white robes danced around sacred flames and eerie chants echoed from caves. People said the blood of Achilles, the hero of Troy, still flowed through the veins of the Molossian line. And so Olympias carried not only royal blood, but also the faint glow of legend. The most sacred symbol of Epirus was the serpent believed to be the messenger of the gods, the guardian spirit of life and death. In rituals, snakes slithered across shoulders, coiled around arms, even crawled over the chests of worshippers without being driven away. Olympias did not fear them. On the contrary, she treated them as allies, as embodiments of invisible power. Whispers spread that she kept serpents in her private chamber, and each night under the moonlight, her body moved with their fluid coils in a dance that bound woman and god together. Servants who witnessed it shuddered. The serpent's eyes glowed with firelight, and in that moment, Olympias's eyes too seemed to blaze with divine force. Many believed she was a priestess chosen by the gods themselves, a bridge between the human and the supernatural. In Epirus, where myth and reality were woven together, such a woman was not only revered but feared. At the heart of this sacred land stood Dodona, the ancient shrine where priests listened to the wind rustling through oak leaves to divine the will of Zeus. Olympias was brought there as a child, taught to hear the whispers in the forest, to read the wind as prophecy. For her, prophecy wasn't empty words, but truth woven into the breath of nature. The people of Epirus believed only the chosen could understand the voice of the wind, and Olympias was one of those few. Prophecies followed her throughout her life. As a young girl, she heard one declare her fate was tied to a mighty king, and that her womb would bear a child who would conquer the world. That prophecy burned like a hidden flame, feeding her will and ambition. From then on, she was not just a princess. She was a priestess with destiny, ready to turn her life into the chessboard of the gods. And so Olympias grew to womanhood, surrounded by sacred rites, by serpents and prophetic winds. She learned not only how to live as a royal princess, but also as a keeper of invisible powers. Where others placed their faith in swords or gold, she trusted in divine signs, in omens that came in dreams, in the hiss of snakes in the dark. This became the foundation for the woman who would later step into the treacherous world of Macedonia, not just as a wife or a queen, but as the embodiment of a mystical power that inspired awe and fear alike. When Olympias arrived in Macedonia, she entered a world completely unlike Epirus. No more whispering forests or sacred serpents coiling around her wrist, but shining war chariots, soldiers drilling under the sun, and a court where power was sharper than any blade. Philip II, the mighty king of Macedonia, was a conqueror of iron and blood, the man who turned a fragmented kingdom into a war machine. His marriage to Olympias, on the surface, was the union of two bloodlines, the sacred Molossian and the conquering Macedonian. But in truth, it was a collision of destinies between a mortal king and a priestess bound to the divine. They say that on their wedding night, Philip witnessed a sight he could never forget. A great serpent slithering across the bed, wrapping itself around Olympias's body. To many, it was a dark omen, but to her, it was proof of the divine. She whispered that Zeus Ammon had blessed her, that her womb would carry a child of destiny. Philip, though a hardened warrior, trembled at the thought that his wife might be bearing a power beyond mortal reach. From that moment on, their marriage was no longer ordinary. It became a clash between the earthly strength of a king and the mystical power of a queen. Olympias was nothing like the other wives in the Macedonian court. She wasn't submissive. She didn't step back. She refused to live under her husband's shadow. Instead, she built a circle of followers around herself, those who worshipped the mysteries, who believed Olympias was not just a queen, but a priestess chosen by the gods. At secret rituals, drums thundered, sacred serpents slithered across the altar, and Olympias appeared like a living goddess. Her presence made many at court both revere her and whisper in fear that she was more dangerous than any army Philip commanded. Philip, with the eyes of a pragmatic general, saw religion as a tool of power. But to Olympias, faith wasn't a tool, it was her very essence. From the beginning, this drove them into conflict. When Philip conquered new lands, he saw spoils, territory, and soldiers. Olympias saw omens, divine signs he could never understand. He wanted a docile wife, but he found himself bound to a woman cloaked in legend. The rift deepened as Philip took more wives. Each new marriage wasn't just an insult to Olympias, but a direct threat to her son's claim. In the Macedonian court, every queen, every concubine, carried political weight, and Olympias, fierce and unyielding, would not allow anyone to endanger what she believed was destiny, her son's right to succeed. When Philip married Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian woman of pure blood, hatred ignited into an unquenchable fire. Cleopatra wasn't just a new lover, she was a political weapon. If she bore a son, that child would be of pure Macedonian lineage, something the nobles prized far more than Alexander, who carried half the blood of Epirus. At the wedding feast, when a drunken guest insulted Alexander, declaring he was unworthy to inherit because he was not fully Macedonian, Olympias rose in fury, her eyes blazing, ready to turn the banquet into a stage for divine punishment. In that moment, Alexander stormed out, while Philip, drunk and enraged, drew his sword on his own son. The hall froze. Everyone understood. The marriage between Philip and Olympias had turned into a battlefield, and Alexander stood at its very center. Olympias did not retreat. She took Alexander back to Epirus, back to the forests, back to the winds of Dodona, nurturing within him the belief that he was a child of destiny. While Philip built armies of steel phalanxes, Olympias built a myth around her son. On one side, earthly power, on the other, divine power. The two forces met in their marriage but would never reconcile. People say Olympias often whispered prophecies into Alexander's ear, that he was not only Philip's son, but also the blood of Zeus. Those words, planted in the soul of a child, grew into the seed of a dream to conquer the world. Without Philip, Alexander would never have commanded an invincible army. But without Olympias, Alexander would never have believed the world was his destiny. And so, the marriage of Philip and Olympias was never a peaceful home. It was a relentless arena, where power, jealousy, faith, and ambition clashed. Each night in the palace at Pella was an invisible war. The king who saw the world through the edge of a sword, against the queen who saw the world through omens and sacred serpents. Between them, there was no love like in romantic songs, only an endless struggle between power and fate. Within the Macedonian court, the cold stone walls echoed, not only with guards' footsteps, but with conspiracies waiting to strike. Every wife of Philip wasn't just a presence in his harem, she was a spear aimed straight at Olympias and her son. And the sharpest spear of all was Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian maiden of pure blood, celebrated by nobles as the very symbol of legitimacy. When Cleopatra entered the palace, Olympias knew it was more than humiliation. It was a declaration of war. Cleopatra didn't come alone. She brought with her a family, a lineage, and a faction eager to cast Alexander aside in favor of the unborn child she carried. In Cleopatra's cold eyes, Olympias saw a dark prophecy. If left unchecked, Alexander would be erased, his name lost like so many forgotten princes in history. Olympias was a woman of the gods, but she was also a woman of flesh and blood. Her heart as a mother was bound to Alexander's. Protecting him wasn't just instinct, it was divine duty. She believed Alexander was the child foretold in prophecy, the blood of Zeus sent to earth to conquer. And so, anyone who threatened him, whether a beautiful consort or an unborn child, became an enemy of the gods themselves. In Philip's final years, as the king marched endlessly on campaign, Olympias quietly spun her own web of power. She drew in the loyal, the outcast servants, and the soldiers who believed Alexander was the son of a god. Within the palace of Pella, where every corridor hid spies, Olympias built a circle of mystery, whispers in the night, incense from rituals. The slithering of serpents beneath the altar all became her silent warning to Cleopatra. You face not just a woman, but the power of the other world. When Cleopatra gave birth to a son, hope surged within her and her family. They believed this boy would be the rightful heir, more legitimate than Alexander, and fully backed by the Macedonian nobility. But to Olympias, that birth was nothing less than a death knell if she didn't act. A queen born in blood, raised among sacred serpents and prophecy, would never allow her son's destiny to be stolen. They say that one morning, before the sunlight even touched the windows, the cries of Cleopatra's baby suddenly fell silent. The night before, guards had seen a white-cloaked figure pass down the corridor, candlelight casting long snake-like shadows on the wall. No one dared to speak Olympias's name, but all understood. Her invisible hand had cut the thread of fate. Cleopatra, once radiant, was turned into a widow, consumed by despair, and her newborn son became a name erased from history before it was ever written. Cleopatra Eurydice barely had time to grieve before the second storm struck. After Philip was assassinated during his daughter's wedding, the world turned upside down. Alexander was crowned king, but the throne of a 20-year-old was not a solid seat. It was a smouldering furnace. Every noble schemed, every enemy waited. In that storm, Olympias rose like a goddess of war, decisive and merciless. Cleopatra and her little daughter, the last fragments of threat, were caught in Olympias's web of fate. They say Cleopatra was imprisoned, and in her despair, she hanged herself, while her daughter died in Olympias's cold embrace. Some whispered Olympias herself struck them down. Others said her sacred serpent slithered into the prison, but the result was the same. The bloodline that rivaled Alexander was erased. The act sent chills through many, but none dared challenge her. They knew Olympias was not merely a mother protecting her son, she was the embodiment of an ancient storm. In a world where the weak were devoured, she chose to devour first, believing the gods stood at her side. Olympias's ruthlessness was not mere vengeance, it was strategy. She knew Alexander, no matter his brilliance, was still just a young man among wolves. If threats weren't cut off at the root, the throne would be nothing but a trap waiting to collapse. And so, with the blood of Cleopatra and her child, she planted the seed of safety for Alexander's reign. To the people, Olympias became a blurred image. On one side, a devoted mother sacrificing all for her son. On the other, the serpent queen, unflinching in offering anyone to the throne. In a flicker of candlelight, they still saw her walk slowly, cloak sweeping stone floors, serpents slithering at her feet, eyes blazing with both holy fire and darkness. None spoke aloud, but all knew. The true power of Macedonia rested not only in Alexander's hands, but also in the cold grip of his mother. When Alexander was crowned king of Macedonia, the court believed the young man of 20 would be nothing more than a shadow of his veteran generals, an easy pawn for nobles to break. But behind the throne stood another figure, Olympias, mother, priestess, and unseen architect of power. If Alexander was the blazing sword, Olympias was the hand gripping its hilt, guiding its strike. From the beginning, she knew Alexander's throne was no gift. It was a battlefield. His enemies weren't only at the borders, but inside the palace, inside the council chamber, in the suspicious glances of Macedonian nobles. Olympias, with the instinct of one who had lived her life in intrigue, knew that to protect Alexander, she had to build a parallel system of power, not just armies, but faith, fear, and alliances sealed in blood. They say she would come to Alexander during long nights, as moonlight poured through stone windows. She whispered into his ear not only the words of a mother, but the voice of prophecy, that he was the son of Zeus, that the world trembled beneath his steps not because of spears, but because destiny had chosen him before birth. Olympias planted in Alexander's heart the iron belief that he was no mortal, that every kingdom, every mountain, every river must bow, and that belief became a weapon stronger than any army. But belief alone was not enough. Olympias knew power stood not only on will but on blood. She wove networks of loyalty throughout Macedonia, servants, slaves, generals. Many followed Alexander not just because he was king, but because they feared his mother's gaze. Olympias never hesitated to strike down enemies. One whisper from her could become a death sentence. One cold gesture could erase an entire family. In court, where words were gilded with flowery speeches, Olympias needed none. She wielded the power of silence, the power of cryptic prophecy that made men shudder. When she declared, "The gods have chosen Alexander," no noble dared object, for to object was to defy not just the throne, but Zeus himself. In a world that lived by omens, her presence was the invisible shield guarding her son. When Alexander began his conquests, leaving Macedonia for Asia, Olympias did not sit quietly like other queens. She remained at home, not in hiding, but as ruler in the shadows. She kept Macedonia steady, ensuring that while Alexander marched abroad, no one dared seize the throne. Every whisper of rebellion she crushed before it could spread. Every plotter vanished in silence. Macedonia stood firm not only through Alexander's sword, but through Olympias's iron hand. People still spoke of her rituals. Under blazing firelight, serpents slid across the altar, while Olympias sat upright, eyes aflame, her voice resonating as if from another world. To soldiers, it was more than ritual, it was a blood oath. They believed fighting for Alexander meant fighting for destiny, and opposing him meant opposing the gods. Olympias had turned religion into a weapon, myth into chains of loyalty. She was also the guardian of Alexander's legacy, while he stayed away too long. Whenever doubts rose, she reminded them that her son was not born merely of mortal flesh, but of Zeus's divine spirit. That claim echoed across the land, making every plot against him tremble. For how could anyone overthrow the son of a god? Olympias was no warrior, but she was an architect. She built a fortress of power not from stone, but from fear and belief. While Alexander conquered distant lands, she conquered the hearts and minds of Macedonia. While he built an empire stretching from Greece to India, she built the throne, strong enough for him to return to. And in every step Alexander took, her mark was there. When he proclaimed himself son of Zeus Ammon in Egypt, it wasn't just the decision of a conqueror, it was the echo of her whispers planted in childhood. When he saw the world as a stage to be conquered, it was the map she had drawn with prophecy. Olympias, in silence, became co-creator of the Alexander legend, not with sword and spear, but with the invisible hand that guided his path. When Alexander the Great drew his last breath in the palace of Babylon, his empire vast as an ocean shattered into 1,000 pieces. The generals who once marched at his side now turned into wolves, tearing at the carcass of the empire. With no grown heir to claim the throne, Macedonia's crown was thrown into a storm of suspicion, betrayal, and blood. Yet in the midst of that chaos, one figure still stood tall: Olympias, the mother of Alexander, the woman who had nurtured a legend and now held its legacy in her hands. The only child who could inherit the throne was Alexander IV, the son of Alexander the Great and Roxana, his Bactrian wife. Just an infant in his cradle, but the blood in his veins was enough to make the whole empire tremble. For once he grew, he would be the sole rightful heir, the descendant of Zeus, the last seed of destiny. Olympias knew, protecting this child meant protecting her son's legacy. And so, once again, she reached out, becoming the mother of destiny. Roxana, the young widow, alone and foreign in the Macedonian court, quickly found in Olympias not just an ally, but a divine protector. She knew that in a world full of enemies, only Alexander's mother had the strength and the ruthlessness to keep her and her child alive. Two women, one from the distant east, one from the wild lands of Epirus, clasped hands, forming a strange but unbreakable alliance. They were not just widow and grandmother, they were the final two pieces holding the legend of Alexander together. Olympias took Roxana and the child back to Epirus, back to the oak forests of Dodona, where the winds carried the voices of the gods. She built around them a wall of faith and myth. They say that in the dark nights, Olympias would cradle Alexander IV in her arms, carry him to the altar, and pray that Zeus would protect his last bloodline. Serpents slithered around the cradle, their eyes glowing like torches, a warning to anyone who dared to harm the child: touch him, and the gods will crush you. Meanwhile, Alexander's generals Ptolemy, Antigonus, Seleucus, Cassander fell upon one another like starving beasts. They divided lands, cities, and armies. But all of them knew the existence of Alexander IV was the greatest threat. As long as the boy lived, their claims of being the true king were lies. And as long as Olympia stood beside him, the flame of Alexander's legend still burned, commanding the loyalty of soldiers and people alike. Olympias did not retreat. She returned to Macedonia during its civil wars, bringing Roxana and her grandson. Her arrival was like thunder across the sky. Crowds poured into the streets. The loyal kneeled. Rebels trembled. Olympias was not just the mother of a dead king. She was the embodiment of memory, a living legend. When she lifted her grandson in her arms, the people saw not a child, but Alexander reborn. In her war against her chief enemy, Cassandra, Olympias did not act like a frail old woman, she fought like a queen of war. She rallied the armies of Epirus, inspired soldiers with prophecies, and turned the conflict into a holy war for Alexander's legacy. They say that before each battle, she placed a serpent on her shoulder, stepped out before the ranks, her eyes blazing like a storm. The soldiers shouted her name, believing the gods themselves marched with them. Olympias won many battles through her sheer aura of legend. Cities opened their gates to her, enemy soldiers deserted at the sound of her name. But in war, not every prophecy comes true. Cassandra, the ruthless old fox, finally cornered her. The city of Pydna, where she, Roxana, and the boy had taken refuge, was besieged. Within its walls, there were no more rituals, no more sacred serpents, only hunger and despair. And yet, even in desperation, Olympias carried herself with the dignity of a goddess. When Cassandra sent envoys, promising her life if she surrendered and gave up the boy, she laughed coldly. She would rather die than hand the child over to her enemies. They say her gaze was so fierce that the envoys staggered back, trembling as if they had faced a curse. In her final days at Pydna, Olympias held Alexander IV in her arms, whispering prophecies as she once had to Alexander the Great. She promised that even if her body fell, her spirit would still protect him, that though surrounded by enemies, he carried within him the power of the gods. And Roxana, though terrified, knelt at her side, believing every word as if it were her own final breath. The fortress of Pydna became a cage of iron. Cassandra's forces tightened their grip, cutting off supplies, letting hunger and despair gnaw at the souls inside. They say in those days, children's cries faded into silence, hearths grew cold, and within those grey walls, only the stench of death lingered. Yet in the shadows, Olympia still stood upright like a stone pillar, her eyes burning, her lips chanting ancient prayers. Cassandra believed starvation would break her, but he was wrong. Olympias was no trembling old woman. She was the living ghost of legend and fate. In her darkest hour, she walked the halls with calm, her white cloak sweeping across the stone, serpents slithering at her feet. And the guards, though starving themselves, still knelt before her. To them, she was not merely the mother of a king, but the living shadow of destiny itself. But destiny, no matter how divine, must still face the blade of men. At last, Cassandra broke through Pydna. He did not unleash his soldiers to slaughter, he sent a promise instead. If Olympias surrendered, her life would be spared. But Olympias, who had lived her life surrounded by betrayal and deceit, knew those words were hollow. She refused, not with pleading, but with a gaze so fierce that the envoys stepped back, as if they had come face to face with a serpent in the dark. Cassandra didn't dare order her execution openly. He feared the wrath of the people, feared that her blood would ignite into a divine fire that could consume all of Macedonia. So he handed the task to Olympias's old enemies, the families who had lost sons, husbands, under her hand. He let mortal hatred do what he himself dared not. On that fateful day, Olympias stepped out without weapon, without shield. She wore a white robe, and upon her shoulders a serpent slithered down like a living ribbon. The crowd screamed, hurled stones, raised blades. But Olympias did not tremble. They said she walked as if entering a sacred altar, as if she herself was the offering to the gods. Her eyes never looked at the executioners, but straight to the heavens, as though she faced Zeus himself. The final blows tore her body apart, but they could not kill the image carved into memory. For when her blood touched the ground, the people did not just see a fallen woman, they saw the serpent queen, the woman who dared defy kings, bishops and lords of power, leaving behind a haunting shadow. Cassandra thought her death would erase Olympias from history. But in that very moment her legend began. They whispered that when her body was abandoned, serpents from the Epirus wilds slithered down, coiling around her corpse as guardians of her soul. Others said that night the winds howled around Dodona, the oaks shrieking a mournful hymn as though the gods themselves wept for their priestess. Olympias had died, but she never vanished. She became a ghost in Macedonian memory, a woman even her enemies could not forget. Her image hair unbound, serpents curling around her shoulders, eyes blazing haunted generations. For she was not only the mother of Alexander, not only a queen, but the embodiment of ambition, ruthlessness, and the belief that destiny could be molded by human hands. If Alexander the Great was the fire that burned the world, then Olympias was the mystical wind that fanned that fire, making it blaze bright in human history. Knossos, the name, echoes like the sound of marble, like the lingering breath of an age when man and myth were not yet divided. On the island of Crete, in the heart of the blue Mediterranean, the ruins of that palace still sprawl, conjuring visions of a world both radiant and mysterious. Archaeologists call Knossos the greatest political and ceremonial center of Minoan civilization, built around 2000 BC and flourishing for centuries. There, they found walls painted with vibrant frescoes, red-painted columns, and twisting corridors linking one chamber to another. But stepping inside, no one can deny a strange impression. Knossos wasn't a palace in the familiar sense, it was a labyrinth. Long corridors, sudden turns, staircases leading into tiny rooms before opening into vast spaces. Even with a map in hand today, one could still get lost. How much more for people of the past. And perhaps from this confusion myth was born, the story of the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull monster imprisoned in the maze. In Greek legend, King Minos of Crete ordered the labyrinth built to contain the Minotaur, the monstrous child of his wife, and a divine bull. That beast fed on human flesh, and Athens, under Minos' rule, was forced to send 7 youths and 7 maidens as tribute, until Theseus, prince of Athens, entered the labyrinth guided by Ariadne's thread and slew the Minotaur. Archaeologists, of course, never found the bones of any monster within Knossos. What they did uncover were storerooms, oil vats, ritual chambers, even an advanced plumbing system far ahead of its time. Yet human imagination can never be separated from those walls. Step into a narrow, dim corridor, its stone painted blood red, and tell me you wouldn't feel the Minotaur lurking just around the corner. Some say the labyrinth wasn't just architecture, it was a metaphor for power. Knossos was so vast and complex that anyone entering had to rely on guides, priests, officials of Minos. Its confusion turned the palace into a living body, devouring all who didn't understand its rules. Perhaps the Minotaur wasn't a beast at all, but Knossos itself, the palace that consumed men. The image of the bull was no accident either. The bull was sacred to the Minoans. On frescoes, men and women are shown leaping over bulls in daring rituals. On altars, bull horns stood as divine symbols. Perhaps from this reverence, the myth of the Minotaur was born. Fear of the sacred animal twisted into monstrous form by later Greek imagination. When archaeologist Arthur Evans excavated Knossos in 1900, he was mesmerized by the palace's complexity. It was Evans who popularized the idea that Knossos was the origin of the labyrinth legend. He rebuilt walls, mapped corridors, and through that reconstruction, Knossos emerged both as archaeological fact and mirror of myth. The strange thing is, even in the modern world, with electric light filling every room and digital maps guiding every step, Knossos still exudes unease. People walk through windowless rooms, dead ends, dark turns, and feel something watching. Perhaps the collective memory of the Minotaur still lingers in those stones. Some scholars have even suggested a bold theory. The Minotaur wasn't a literal monster, but a symbol for human victims. Perhaps Crete once demanded tribute from Athens. Perhaps human sacrifice rituals existed, and over time, memory turned to myth. Instead of speaking of youths offered up, people said, they were thrown to a beast. Whatever the truth, Knossos stands at the crossroads of archaeology and myth. It is both the palace of a sophisticated civilization with water pipes, storerooms, and stunning art, and the labyrinth where imagination spun terrifying tales. Stand before those towering red-black columns, place your hand on the stone worn by centuries, and you may hear the footsteps of Theseus, the roar of the Minotaur, and the trembling thread of Ariadne in the dark. Knossos, therefore, was never just ruins. It was a bridge between two worlds, the world of archaeology, with its hard evidence, and the world of myth, with the darkness and fear carried in the human heart. And it is this overlap that makes Knossos a place where every step is both into history and into legend. A place where we ask, was it the palace itself, and not the monster, that was the true Minotaur? Looking at Knossos and the remains scattered across the island of Crete, the wonder lies not only in its scale, but in its sophistication far ahead of its time. The Minoans people who lived more than 3,500 years ago built a civilization whose many features seem to belong to a future thousands of years beyond their own. Archaeologists uncovered water pipes and drainage systems, proof that the Minoans knew how to control the flow of water for daily life. While much of Europe still lived in rough simplicity, here on Crete, clean water flowed through clay pipes, washing away the dust of the palace. There were ceramic bathtubs, stone gutters, details that leave even the modern world astonished. Perhaps our distant ancestors already knew comforts we believed belonged only to us. And in the imagination of later Greeks, such works were no less than the creations of Hephaestus, the divine smith, who forged wonders beyond human hands. The palace of Knossos was not a single massive block of stone, but a multi-layered, branching complex like a miniature city. Staircases, long corridors, sunlit courtyards, ceremonial halls glowing with colour, all combined into a structure so intricate that even modern minds struggle to piece it together. Was it this very complexity that birthed the story of the labyrinth? To later Greeks, wandering through Knossos' halls, it must have seemed only the hands of gods could create such confusion. Minoan art reveals a spirit unlike any other. On the walls of Knossos, colours still shine. The blue of the sea, the red of the earth, the orange of the sun. The Minoans painted dolphins leaping, lilies blooming, dancers vaulting with bulls. Not war, not kings, but life itself, joy itself, a gentle human breath. People say that in the Minoan world, art was praise for nature, and the gods lived in every flower, every animal, every wave. Trade was the lifeblood of this civilization. Crete's central location in the Mediterranean made it a crossroads of sea routes. From Egypt came gold, ivory, and religious ideas. From the Near East, tin, gemstones, and early writing. In return, they exported olive oil, wine, and pottery with exquisite designs. Amphorae from Crete have been found on the coasts of Syria and the Nile Delta, footprints of a civilization trading far and wide. In imagination, one can see the Minoan ships cutting through the waves, sails full of wind, decks loaded with jars of fragrant wine, and below deck, merchants speaking in many tongues. Perhaps it was this very bustle that made the Greeks later picture Crete as the realm of King Minos, lord of the seas, granted power by Poseidon. For who but the god of the sea himself could give these people mastery over trade and the waves? These works, architecture, art, commerce, did not stand apart, but wove together into a world where mortals touched the divine. Water pipes were not just technology, but signs that the gods had shown mankind how to tame nature. Dolphin frescoes were not mere decoration, but prayers to the sea, a god that both nourished and threatened. And the ships carried not only goods, but also stories and myths, planting the seeds of the Minotaur and labyrinth across Greece. Today, standing before the black and red walls that remain, looking up the crumbling stairways that once climbed to higher floors, we see not only traces of engineering, but hear echoes of the past. We see Minoan traders returning from Egypt, bearing strange goods. We see artisans mixing colours, painting walls with passion. We see crowds in festival, carrying snakes and bullhorns in mysterious rites. The Minoans, then, were not just an archaeological civilization. They were a crossroads world, where advanced technology blended with myth, where water pipes could feel like magic, where multi-story palaces became mythical labyrinths, where commerce and art became the language through which humans spoke with the gods. And in the imagery of the Minoans, no symbol appeared more often than the bull. On the frescoes of Knossos, we see young men vaulting over the backs of bulls in a daring ritual. One grabs the horns, flips through the air, another waits behind to catch. It was sport, religion, sacrifice, all at once. Archaeologists call it bull leaping, and even now it stirs debate. Was it performance for entertainment, or a sacred rite proving human strength before divine power? Bullhorns were everywhere in the palace. On walls, on altars, above gateways, the sweeping curves like a crescent moon, symbols of life, the sun, of masculine energy overflowing. The Minoans seemed to see bulls as a bridge between man and cosmos, both common in farm life and exalted in worship. Perhaps it was from this reverence that the Minotaur myth was born, fear of the bull taking shape as a man-eating beast. Alongside bulls, snakes were equally vital symbols. In terracotta figurines unearthed at Knossos, we see goddesses or priestesses, arms raised, snakes coiling around them. Snakes, in nearly all ancient cultures, carried meanings of rebirth, shedding skin to live anew, like the earth splitting open for new crops. In the Minoan world, snakes may have embodied the earth goddess bringer of life, protector of home. The famous snake goddess statue shows a bare-chested woman, holding snakes in both hands, eyes blazing as if holding the secrets of life and death. When archaeologists unearthed these figures, they did not just see art. They touched the sacred obsession of the Minoans. Perhaps, in dark ceremonies, with torches flickering, priestesses really did stand in the circle, letting serpents coil around their arms, proving the gods had entered their flesh. Perhaps the hiss of snakes was the whisper of Mother Earth herself, reminding mankind that life was only borrowed. Both bulls and serpents intertwined in the sacred rituals of Crete. Archaeologists have found outdoor altars where animal blood was offered to the gods. They've uncovered deep caves, filled with incense smoke, echoing drum beats, and worshippers gathered in the dark. Perhaps it was in these caves that the stories of Minos, Pasiphae, and the Minotaur were woven, where bull worship merged with the primal fear of night. The frescoes at Knossos reveal a religion centered more on goddesses than gods. Women appear as the focal figures, leading ceremonies, standing at altars, holding serpents, commanding the power of bulls. Men, by contrast, often appear in supporting roles as dancers or attendants. This has led many scholars to believe the Minoans practiced a matriarchal or semi-matriarchal society, where women were tied to the earth, fertility, and spiritual authority. And yet, when we look at all these symbols, bulls, serpents, goddesses, we cannot separate them from myth. Was the Minotaur, half man, half bull, a distorted reflection of bull-leaping rituals? Were the serpents in the hands of the goddess the inspiration for Medusa? And was the palace of Knossos itself, with its altars and ritual, chambers the belly of a giant creature, where humans were swallowed only to be reborn? These questions have no certain answers, but it is precisely this blur between archaeology and mythology that makes Minoan culture so captivating. People uncover pottery, frescoes, and idols, evidence of material life. Yet they also hear the echoes of myth, the bellow of bulls in festival, the hiss of serpents in darkness, the cheers as a youth soared over a bull's back. It's not just archaeology, it's collective memory, the fears and faith of humanity from over 3 millennia ago. When we compare Minoan civilization to classical Greece, or the Mycenaeans, the differences stand out like two separate worlds. The later Greeks etched images of warriors, bronze shields, iron swords, bloody expeditions, heroes falling in the smoke of Troy. But in Crete, during the Minoan era, there is no evidence of a society built on war, no fortified citadels, no monuments to victory, no mass graves filled with weapons. Instead, what remains are frescoes, offerings, and traces of ritual. Many scholars believe this lack of militarization defined the Minoan identity. They didn't build fortresses to resist enemies. They built palaces like Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia, centers that were at once political, religious, and artistic. There, instead of the hammering of swords, you would hear the sound of lyres, drums, and chants during ceremonies. Instead of war walls, you would see frescoes of dolphins, lilies, and brightly dressed maidens, a civilization focused on ritual and beauty, more than battle and destruction. This doesn't mean the Minoans were weak. On the contrary, their strength lay in the sea and trade, a soft weapon, but a powerful one. Rather than conquering with swords, they spread influence with ships and goods. Through trade, Minoan art reached across the Mediterranean, from the shores of Egypt to the island of Cyprus. If the Mycenaeans left memories of warriors, the Minoans left memories of artisans, merchants and priests, masters of symbol and spirit. In Minoan palaces, there were no rooms filled with war spoils, but vast ritual spaces. Altars, goddess statues, pottery jars for wine and oil used in ceremonies. Frescoes show processions carrying offerings, dancing around bulls, or presenting flowers to a goddess. A society where ritual seemed to be the very heartbeat, binding kings and commoners alike. Perhaps that is why Minoan civilization feels drenched in myth, because art and faith walked hand in hand. When dolphins leapt across frescoes, it wasn't just decoration, but a prayer for safe voyages. When snake figurines were crafted, they weren't just pottery, but guardians of the household. When bullhorns crowned sacred sites, they weren't just symbols, but reminders that the gods were ever present. What's striking is how rarely Minoan art depicts war or killing. While many ancient civilizations carved scenes of kings trampling enemies, Crete's frescoes overflow with life. Flowers, animals, the sea, dance. You could say the Minoans celebrated life more than death. This is why archaeology often views them as a relatively peaceful society, less militarized, more devoted to art and ritual. And yet, we can't forget that within the shadows of ritual, there may have been darker truths. Some theories suggest that behind the festivals and bull leaping, there were human sacrifices. Certain archaeological finds hint that children's bones may have been killed in religious contexts. If true, then Minoan art and ritual weren't purely light. They may have masked blood offerings. Perhaps this memory transformed into the myth of the Minotaur, the beast devouring Athens' youth. This adds a darker layer to the Minoan picture. They didn't glorify war, but perhaps ritual itself became a battlefield. Bloodshed, not in open combat, but on the altar. A society, at once peaceful and terrifying, one that placed art and religion at its center, yet still carried a monster in its heart. Today, as we walk through the halls of Knossos, the contrast is clear. This is no fortress. It is an open palace, with sunlit courtyards, walls painted with seas, and richly adorned ritual rooms. Yet even in that light, the echoes of myth remain. The roar of the Minotaur, the breath of sacred serpents, and the eternal question, did art and faith truly replace violence, or were they simply another form of violence, sanctified? The Minoan civilization once shone like a sun over the Mediterranean, but around 1400 BC, that light was extinguished. Knossos fell. The centers of Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros crumbled. Its sudden disappearance became one of archaeology's greatest mysteries, and fertile ground where myth and science intertwine. One familiar theory is tied to the volcano of Thera, today's Santorini. Around the 16th–15th century BC, one of the largest eruptions in human history tore the island apart, blasting most of Santorini into the sky and leaving behind a giant crater now sunk beneath the sea. Ash clouds rose into the atmosphere, blanketing the skies of the entire eastern Mediterranean. If this really happened, Crete, less than 150 kilometers away, must have suffered terrible consequences. Archaeological layers of ash show land buried, crops failing, and sunlight disappearing for months. But it wasn't just ash. When Thera exploded, massive tsunamis may have slammed into Crete's shores. Picture waves dozens of meters high crashing into harbors, smashing ships, erasing coastal towns. For a civilization that lived by seaborne trade, the destruction of its ports was like having its heart ripped out. Perhaps it was in memory of this cataclysm that the myth of Atlantis was born, an island power swallowed by the sea in a single day and night. Even so, many archaeologists stress that the Minoan civilization did not collapse immediately after the eruption. Knossos remained for more than a century. That opens the second theory, the invasion of the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. The Mycenaeans, the warriors immortalized by Homer in the Iliad, were very different from the Minoans. They built massive stone fortresses, filled their tombs with weapons, and made war their pride. When Crete weakened after disaster, the Mycenaeans may have marched in, conquered, and absorbed the Minoan culture. Archaeological evidence shows the appearance of Linear B script, an early form of Greek, in Minoan palaces after this period, clear signs that power had changed hands. A third theory highlights internal weakness. The Grand Palace of Knossos, the vast trade network, all required complex management. Perhaps the very tangle of political structures, class tensions, or over-reliance on ritual shook society from within. If the Minoans poured their energy into art and religion but neglected military strength, then when crisis struck, they had no tools to defend themselves. Like a labyrinth with no exit, the civilization collapsed into its own darkness. And yet, myth still seeps through the cracks of science. Later, Greeks told that Minos, the legendary king after death, became a judge in the underworld, seated with Rhadamanthus and Aeacus to weigh the souls of the dead. Was this imagination's way of preserving the fall of the Minoans? That an entire civilization descended into a collective underworld, leaving ruins for posterity, while itself turned into a ghost in humanity's memory? The ruins of Knossos tell a story half light, half shadow. Some rooms burned, charred wood still blackening the walls. Pottery lies shattered as if people fled in chaos. Yet the frescoes remain dazzling, dolphins swimming in blue waves, maidens smiling in festival, as though art itself tried to hold on to the light, even as the civilization sank into darkness. Perhaps the truth of the Minoan collapse lies not in a single cause, but in layers of disaster, conflict, and fragility. Thera's eruption damaged the land and economy. Tsunamis destroyed the harbours. The Mycenaeans brought their swords when Crete was exhausted, and within, a society too bound to ritual lacked the strength to protect itself. Looking back, the Minoan world is like a bright painting torn apart by invisible hands, but its disappearance also turned it into legend. If the Minoans had survived into our time, we might see them as just another ancient civilization, but because they vanished so suddenly, they became a mystery, the seed of Atlantis, of the Minotaur, of unanswered questions. And in the winds that whistle through Knossos' ruins, people still hear the whisper. Perhaps the gods grew jealous of a people too close to nature, too radiant in art, too careless of war, and so buried them under ash and sea. In 1900, the British archaeologist Arthur Evans stepped onto Crete with the conviction that a forgotten civilization lay hidden here. Digging into the earth, he uncovered walls, columns, radiant frescoes, the ruins of Knossos. It was Evans who named the civilization Minoan, after King Minos of Greek myth, as though from the very beginning, history and legend were fused as one. Evans did not just excavate, he rebuilt. He re-erected the red and black columns, repainted the frescoes, reconstructed the multi-level rooms. His work has been criticized by many scholars too romantic, too bold, at times even invented. But because of it, Knossos became not only a site of archaeology, but of imagination. Today, visitors walk through halls Evans restored, and in that moment, they stand both in ancient ruins and inside a mythical labyrinth. Knossos, thanks to Evans, became a double symbol. Scientifically, it is the center of Minoan civilization, evidence of art, trade, religion, architecture. Mythically, it is the labyrinth of the Minotaur, the palace of King Minos, the shadow of Atlantis, a place both real and unreal, both certain and uncertain. Standing before Knossos today, we see not only stones and pillars, we see Minoan youths vaulting over bulls to cheers. We see the snake goddess raising her arms, eyes glowing in firelight. We see Theseus entering the labyrinth, Ariadne's thread trembling in the dark. Knossos is both an archaeological city and a stage for human imagination. The Minoan civilization and the palace of Knossos vanished more than 3,000 years ago, but through the work of Arthur Evans, they were reborn in modern memory as a civilization that stood between two worlds. On one side archaeology, with its solid evidence, and on the other, myth, with its monsters and labyrinths. Perhaps it is this very blur that keeps the Minoans from ever truly dying. They still live. In the walls of Knossos, in the legend of the Minotaur, and in humanity's eternal question. Can history ever be separated from myth? Or is myth simply the way we remember history? On the wide fields of Latium, where the Roman sun rose red over the barley fields, there was a shepherd boy named Marcus Valerius Severus. His family was poor, part of the plebeians, surviving only on barren land and a thin flock of sheep. His father had once been a soldier in the Roman legion, returning from a war against the Samnites with a wound that never healed, forced to hang his sword on the wall for good. His mother, a hard-working woman, spent her days worrying about food, yet always taught Marcus about honor, about duty to the community and to the gods. Marcus's childhood was nothing but work and hardship. In the mornings, he drove the sheep to the hills. In the evenings, he sat by the fire listening to his father recount battles of the past, when Roman war horns thundered across the valleys. In that small thatched hut, the boy's eyes lit up whenever he heard of the Roman eagle, the symbol of power and glory. He dreamed of one day wearing armor, carrying a shield, and marching with the legions under the sacred Son of Mars. But life was more than dreams. Winter came, the cold cut like blades, and many families starved. From an early age, Marcus learned endurance, going hungry, sleeping on damp ground, wearing torn wool cloaks without complaint. That harshness forged a strong body and a steel spirit. He was not just strong, he was relentless. Years later, veterans would say, Severus does not fall, even when whole legions collapse. One afternoon, at just 14, Marcus witnessed a sight burned into his memory. Raiders from Etruria swept down, looting and burning a nearby village. The people of Latium gathered, wielding ploughs and hoes in a desperate defence. Marcus, clutching only his shepherd's staff, charged at one of the raiders and knocked him into the mud. His eyes burned, lit like torches. Those who saw whispered, "This boy carries the blood of Mars." His father, though weak, laid a hand on his shoulder and said, "My son, a sword is not just iron and steel, it is a vow. One day, you will swear before the eagle, before Rome. When that time comes, remember, your blood does not flow only for your family, but for eternal Rome." Those words carved themselves into Marcus's heart like stone. He understood. For a peasant, there was only one way to rise, become a legionary, wield the sword for the fate of the empire. At 16, Marcus began training with whatever he could. With no bronze armour, he strapped planks of wood to his chest as a shield. With no iron sword, he sharpened a branch into a blade. Day after day, he ran across the fields, lifted stones, and struck tree trunks with his staff. Whenever exhaustion crushed him, he looked up at the statue of Mars standing at the village's edge and whispered, "I must be worthy." At 18, when Rome called for new recruits for the northern campaigns, Marcus left his poor home. He embraced his parents one last time, his mother weeping, his father's eyes glowing with silent pride. The villagers sent him off with a few pieces of dry bread, hurried embraces, and blessings for safety. But Marcus never looked back. He knew that from that moment on, his poor childhood in Latium was only a memory. Ahead lay the path of sword, blood, and glory, the path once walked by Roman heroes, and now, by him. Marcus stepped into the recruitment camp outside the gates of Rome, where hundreds of young men from all over Latium, Campania, and Etruria had gathered. The clash of iron rang out, orders were barked in quick succession, and the mix of sweat and dust filled the air, heavy yet sacred. Atop a tall pole, the golden eagle of the legion blazed in the sunlight, its wings spread wide as if embracing all the Roman sky. Marcus's eyes locked on that symbol, his chest swelling as if it might burst. On the first day, the recruits were lined up, stripped of their peasant clothes, and dressed in coarse, dark red chitons. The drill master roared, his voice like thunder. "From now on, you are no longer common men. You belong to Rome. Your blood and breath belong to Rome. If you cannot endure, step out now and return to farming. But once you swear the oath, betrayal will be punished by death." No one left the line. Marcus stood tall, eyes burning, his hand gripping the spear he had just been given. In his heart, his father's words echoed, "A sword is a vow." Training began with what seemed like cruel drills. Recruits were forced to carry wooden shields twice as heavy as the real ones, wield wooden swords twice the weight of iron, and strike posts thousands of times until their shoulders went numb and their palms bled. Marcus clenched his teeth and endured. Every strike he imagined as an offering to Mars, an echo carried back to Latium. The weak collapsed, some vomited, some wept, but Marcus stood firm, like an oak tree in a storm. At night, in the camp, the young men lay around the fire. Some sighed, others told stories of home. Marcus stayed silent, staring only at the golden eagle gleaming in the shadows. To him, that image had become his sole destination. The great day came after 3 months of training. All recruits gathered in the parade ground. Before them stood the legatus, the legion's commander draped in a red cloak, holding a ceremonial sword. Behind him the golden eagle glittered, borne by the aquilifer, like a divine light. The general's voice thundered, "From this day forth you are soldiers of Rome. What do you swear?" Hundreds of voices roared as one, echoing into the sky. "We swear loyalty to the Republic and to the Legion. We swear never to retreat, never to flee, to fight to the last drop of blood for the glory of Rome." Marcus shouted louder than all, his throat burning, his heart pounding like a drum. In that moment, he no longer felt like a poor shepherd boy. His blood merged with the collective oath, becoming part of Rome's immortal lifeblood. After the oath, the general raised his sword toward the east, where the far frontiers lay. "From here, you will march to Gaul, Germania, Hispania. You will bring victory back to Rome, or let your bones rot in foreign soil. That is the fate of a Roman soldier, The cry of Roma, Roma, thundered, drowning out even the wind. Marcus gripped his shield tight, pride swelling in his chest, mingled with a shadow of fear. He knew his life was now bound to that eagle. There was no turning back. That night, Marcus did not sleep. He sat by the pole where the eagle stood, watching the moonlight glint on its golden wings. In his heart, he whispered a vow. Mars, bear witness. I, Marcus Valerius Severus, give myself to Rome. Grant me the strength never to shame this oath. And in the wind, there seemed to be a distant drumbeat, like the reply of the god of war. The road that led the legion into Gaul stretched endlessly, winding through misty mountains and deep shadowed forests. Marcus and his comrades marched in step to the sound of horns, their feet hardened by dust and stone, their backs weighed down by iron armor and gear. But when the army crossed the hills and saw the land of Gaul spread before them, every heart surged with fire. This was the land of barbarians, where Rome would either plant its laws or fall, leaving their bodies for the Black Crows. The first clash came sooner than expected. Scouts brought word. A Gallic tribe had gathered over 2,000 warriors to block the legion's path. That morning, before the fog had lifted, the war drums of the Gauls thundered from the forest. They appeared with long-braided hair, bare chests, axes, and wooden shields in hand, howling like beasts. They stomped the earth until it shook, and blew horns made of oxen horns that roared across the field. Marcus stood in formation, gripping his heavy pilum, the Roman throwing spear. His heart pounded like a drum, sweat trickling down his spine. But when the centurion shouted, "Hold the line, do not waver," Marcus felt his fear harden into a burning tension. Around him were young faces, like his own, who had left home only to meet death for the first time. The Roman horns blared. Thousands of pila flew, ripping through the air with a deadly hiss. The first Gauls fell, shields shattered, bodies torn open in blood. Savage shouts turned into cries of pain, yet they did not fall back. Wave after wave, the Gauls charged like a raging sea. As the distance closed, Marcus raised his shield against an axe swing, heavy as a hammer. The clash rang sharp, his arm numb from the blow. Without thinking, he thrust his gladius, the short Roman sword, into his enemy's belly. Hot blood sprayed, the stench rushing into his nose. The Gaul collapsed, eyes rolling back. It was the first man Marcus had ever killed with steel. The battle descended into chaos. Steel on steel, screams, the shrill cries of horses, blood streaming across the earth. Marcus slashed, dodged, and shouted, as if his voice could drown the fear. Inside him, a massive Gaul charged, slamming his wooden shield so hard that Marcus stumbled back. In an instant, the axe came down like thunder, but the centurion nearby lunged forward, driving his spear through the Gaul's chest. Even as he fell, the warrior screamed, his curse ringing in Marcus's ears. The clash raged from dawn until late afternoon. By sunset, the forest floor was strewn with corpses. Thousands of bodies lay in heaps, and already black crows circled above. Marcus dropped to the ground, his armor soaked red. He didn't know if it was his blood or another's. His hands shook, but his eyes burned bright. He knew he had crossed the threshold of youth. He was no longer a shepherd boy, but a soldier of Rome. The centurion marched along the line, his voice hoarse yet proud. "You have done what Rome demanded. Gallic blood has soaked this earth, and your names are written into the history of the legion." Marcus raised his eyes to the golden eagle held high above the battlefield. In the glow of sunset, its wings shimmered red with blood and fire. In his heart a voice rang out, "This is your fate. You were born to fight, to die, and to live forever in Rome's song." That night, the legion lit fires across the field. The living ate dry bread and drank watered wine, while the dead were laid in rows, covered with earth to the sound of prayers. Marcus sat beside the bodies of comrades, faces still young, like his own, now lifeless. He did not cry. He only gripped his gladius tighter, vowing their blood would not be wasted. In the flickering firelight, the Gallic wind screamed through the forest, like the voices of ghosts. But Marcus kept his gaze fixed on the golden eagle, the eternal flame burning in the heart of every Roman soldier. After their first victory in Gaul, the legion pushed deeper into barbarian lands. They built camps in dark forests, where fog clung to every tree, and the howl of wolves echoed through the black night. days of conquest followed, filled with blood and smoke. But within that brutal spiral, Marcus found a light he had never expected. Aelia, a Celtic girl captured after a battle. Aelia was brought back to camp with the other prisoners. Unlike the bitter defiance of her people, her eyes carried something both proud and quiet. When Marcus first saw her, her golden hair was tangled and dusty, yet her face still shone like a ray of sunlight piercing through the rain. The soldiers laughed, mocking the captives, but Marcus stopped them. He didn't know why, but in those eyes he saw something that made a warrior's heart falter. Marcus was assigned to guard the prisoners. Each night, when handing them their coarse bread, he would quietly place a little extra water for Aelia. She didn't say much, only nodded, but in her eyes there was gratitude. Over the days, those nods became hesitant words. She told him her homeland had burned in Roman smoke, her parents fallen beneath legionary swords. Yet her voice held no bitterness, only the whisper of memory. One night, the camp was attacked without warning. A band of surviving Gaulish warriors slipped in, burning tents and killing guards. Marcus rushed in just in time to see one raider about to strike Aelia down, to free her from captivity. Without hesitation, Marcus raised his shield against the blow, then drove his gladius through the attacker. Aelia collapsed beside the fire, her eyes wide with shock. She realized that the very man she had called an enemy had saved her life. From that night, an invisible bond began to tighten. In a camp full of blood and iron, among war cries and the moans of the dying, Marcus and Aelia found quiet moments. When the legion marched, Aelia walked bound with the others, and Marcus often stepped close to shield her from the cold wind. At rest, he told her about Latium, about his sheep, about the small hearth where his mother still waited. Aelia listened in silence, sometimes smiling faintly, as if those images revived a homeland she had lost. Marcus knew this bond was dangerous. Roman military law was strict. A soldier was forbidden to let emotion sway his loyalty. Yet his heart, once hardened in battle, now trembled at the faintest smile of a barbarian girl. And with each dawn, as he strapped on his armor, Marcus found a new reason to survive, to see those blue eyes again. Aelia, deep within, was torn as well. She was the daughter of a man who had fought Rome, yet this Roman soldier had saved her, treating her like a human being, not a slave. Amid the roar of war, a fragile, forbidden love had taken root like a wildflower blooming from blood-soaked stone. The Rhine in winter roared with fury, its grey waters like a mirror of the dark sky. On the bank, the Roman legion built its camp, rows of sharpened wooden stakes jutting outward like the fangs of a giant beast. Across the river, the shapes of Germanic tribes flickered through the fog, towering warriors with braided hair, heavy weapons, eyes burning like hunting wolves. Reports spread. They had gathered tens of thousands, ready to challenge the might of Rome. In camp, Marcus sat sharpening his gladius. The steel reflected a lean but unyielding face. Outside, the sound of horns, the pounding of stakes, the shouts of soldiers drilling echoed like the overture to a bloody symphony. Inside, Marcus burned not only the familiar fear of battle, but a quiet fire. The oath before the eagle, and the image of Aelia, still held behind the camp among the prisoners. The day of battle came. The sky was grey, the wind icy cold. The legion crossed the river on a wooden bridge. Beneath their feet, the Rhine raged, as if ready to sweep everything away. As soon as they reached the far shore, the horns of the Germanic tribes thundered. They charged out of the mist, wooden shields pounding against axes, mouths roaring wild cries like rolling thunder. "Hold the line, shields locked, peeler ready," the centurion bellowed. Marcus stood in the front rank, heart hammering like a war drum. As the enemy closed in, thousands of peeler flew like a storm of iron. Germanic warriors collapsed, but the ranks behind surged forward, their shouts rising over the wind. The two sides crashed together, shield against shield, sword against axe, blood spraying in streams. Marcus swung his shield to shove back an opponent, his gladius stabbing quick into the gap beneath leather armor. A giant Germanic warrior charged like a bear, axe crashing down. The block left Marcus's arm trembling, but he twisted, driving his blade into the man's thigh. The warrior howled, collapsing and dragging down two of his kin. The battlefield turned into a swamp of blood, bodies piled, the wind heavy with the stench of iron and death. In the chaos, Marcus saw the centurion surrounded by 4 enemies. Without thought, he shouted, charging like a living spear. His gladius slashed across, biting into a throat, hot blood spraying. Back to back with the centurion, Marcus blocked each axe blow, each spear thrust. At last, as the legion pushed with all its force, the Germanic warriors broke and retreated into the forest, leaving the ground littered with the dead. By evening, the sky blazed red. On the banks of the Rhine, the golden eagle was raised high, reflecting the sunset like an eternal flame. The legion roared. "Roma! Roma!" The cry rolled across the water, drowning even the wolves howling on the far shore. Marcus stood among the ranks, his armor soaked in blood, his breath ragged. In that moment, he knew he had become part of Rome's epic, a place where soldiers fought not only for land, but for the immortality of the empire. That night in camp, Aelia searched for Marcus from afar. The firelight revealed his blood-streaked but radiant face. She knew that amid the raging Rhine and the blood-soaked Germanic woods, a small legend had begun. The legend of the shepherd boy from Latium, now a warrior, carrying within his heart the pulse of all Rome. Marcus returned to Rome with the victorious legion. The city erupted in celebration. Stone-paved streets overflowed with cheering crowds, showering laurel leaves onto the soldiers' heads. Above them, the golden eagle glittered in the sunlight, like a god flying home. Brass horns blared across the Roman Forum, joined by rolling drums, turning the whole city into a blazing sea of sound. Marcus marched in formation, his armor gleaming, a fresh scar across his face. People pointed at him, shouting, "That's the hero of the Rhine." Children ran alongside, chanting, "Severus, Severus." Marcus heard them, his heart swelling with pride. He remembered his poor childhood in Latium, remembered sharpening a wooden branch into a sword, remembered the oath beneath the eagle's wings. Now, Rome itself was calling his name. After the triumph, the soldiers were rewarded, gold, land, and the honor of sitting with citizens at the games. Marcus received a small plot near the Tiber, along with enough wealth to lift his parents out of poverty. He was invited to banquets hosted by officials, where wine overflowed, roasted meat filled the air with its scent, and praise flowed without end. But amid the light of glory, Marcus began to see the darkness hidden in Rome's heart. Senators in white togas sat in marble halls, pointing fingers as they debated the fate of the nation. But in truth, only plotting for power. Generals who had once fought shoulder to shoulder on the battlefield now whispered intrigues behind palace walls. At the banquet tables, words dripped with the stench of betrayal. Rome, the city he had dreamed of as the summit of honor, now appeared behind a mask of deceit. While Marcus was praised, Aelia remained a prisoner, kept on the outskirts. Though many had pleaded for her freedom, she was only allowed to serve in a noble household. Each time Marcus saw her behind the fences, his heart grew heavy. Glory belonged to him, but love was shackled by Rome's iron laws. He began to understand that victory on the battlefield was far easier than overcoming the invisible chains of Rome. One evening, Marcus was invited to a banquet in the villa of a powerful senator. The hall glittered with gold and silver, dancers sang and swayed, wine poured without pause. The senator raised his cup in toast, his voice honeyed. "Rome needs warriors like you, Severus. But Rome also needs men who know how to stand on the right side of politics." Marcus remained silent. He knew the right side the man spoke of was not the fatherland, but a faction in the struggle for power. In that moment, a painful question rose in his heart. What truly is Rome? The shining eagle on the battlefield, or the serpent hidden in the Senate halls? That night, as he stepped out of the villa, Marcus looked up at the Roman sky. Amid torches and cheers, a deep loneliness settled over him like the night itself. He understood then. The path of a Roman soldier was not paved only with victories, but with the torment of standing between ideals and reality, between the light and the shadows of the very empire to which he had sworn his blood. That summer, Rome no longer rang with the sound of triumphal horns, but with the heavy march of legions upon its own soil. After campaigns on the frontiers, powerful generals returned not to honor the fatherland, but to seize the throne in the shadows of a crumbling republic. The Senate was divided, senators bribed, great families raising banners of their own. Rome, once the heart that united millions, was now torn apart by the ambition of its leaders. Marcus, the loyal soldier, was summoned into a legion, commanded by a general he had once respected. On the day he received the order, his heart sank. The enemy was no longer Gauls, Germans, or Carthaginians. It was fellow Romans. The men who had stood beside him on the Rhine, who had shared dry bread, now bore different standards, shouting different slogans. The first battle of the Civil War came on the banks of the Rubicon. 2 Roman legions faced each other, ranks steady, golden eagles blazing in the sun. The horns sounded, but instead of rage, Marcus felt his guts twist. Through the shield wall, his eyes met those of a soldier across the field, not a stranger, but a comrade from Gaul. In that gaze, Marcus saw his own horror reflected back. Then came the order to charge. Thousands of pila flew, cutting the air like spears of fate. Those who fell were no longer fair-haired barbarians, but sun-browned faces from Latium and Campania, men who had sworn the same oath under the same sky. When the shields crashed and blades clashed, the air shook not only with iron, but with cries that tore the soul. "Brothers, why is this happening?" Marcus cut down a man rushing at him, then froze, realizing it was a countryman who had once shared bread with him on a rainy night at the Rhine. He staggered, his heart choking, but the blood of battle forced him to live, to kill, or be killed. Every strike, every spray of blood, cut deeper into his heart. The fighting raged all day, until the earth was soaked in blood, and the sky clouded with smoke. When the order to retreat was given, Marcus dropped to his knees, his hands drenched in Roman blood. Around him lay heaps of corpses, many once comrades, men who had sung victory songs by his side. That night, the Roman camp sank into a heavy silence. No one sang, no one raised wine. Soldiers looked at each other, and in their eyes was only emptiness. Marcus sat alone, his gladius across his knees. He remembered his father's words. The sword is a vow. But a vow to whom? To Rome, where senators sold their souls for power? To a general who used the blood of soldiers as steps to his own glory? Or to the brothers now lying dead at his feet? A night wind swept through, carrying the stench of smoke and blood. Marcus looked up at the starry sky. But instead of light, he saw only suffocating black. Civil war had turned Rome against itself, and turned men like him into blades cutting down their own kin. Inside Marcus, a deep crack opened. He was still a soldier, but his pure faith in Rome, its immortal greatness, was now stained with blood, fractured beyond repair. And he knew, from this moment on, the song of his life would not be one of triumph alone, but the tragic ballad of an empire driving its sword into its own heart. Amid the chaos of civil war, Marcus heard news that the Gaulish and Celtic prisoners once brought to Rome had been sold to noble households as labourers. Among them was Aelia. The news cut into his heart like a blade. Since leaving Rome to march under orders, he had not seen her again. The image of her golden hair and proud eyes had remained the flame that lit his path through the storms of blood. But now, in the empire's frenzy, Aelia was just another fragile life, easily crushed. One evening, when the legion encamped near Rome, Marcus slipped away to the villa where Aelia was held. She was now a servant, wearing coarse cloth, her hands calloused from work. But when her eyes met his in the glow of sunset, time seemed to stop. They dared not speak much. One glance was enough to hold 1,000 words. Marcus handed her a piece of bread, just as he had in the Gaulish camp, and whispered, "Aelia, I will find a way to free you. Rome may drown in blood, but I will not lose you." Aelia smiled sadly. "Marcus, you are a soldier of an empire. I am only a prisoner. Our paths were set long ago, and they will never truly cross." Days later, tragedy struck. Aelia's master, allied with one faction of the civil war, was taken down by rivals seeking revenge. The villa was burned, slaves dragged into the streets for execution as a show of power. In the crowd, Marcus fought his way desperately forward, but only in time to see Aelia kneeling beneath the torches. She did not cry. She did not beg. Her blue eyes stared into the mob in defiance, as if to say, "I am the daughter of freedom. You may chain my body, but you cannot kill my spirit." The blade fell. Blood spilled across the stone steps. In that instant, Marcus wanted to scream, to charge forward, but iron discipline and ranks of guards bound his feet. His heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. That night, Marcus sat alone outside the camp. his gladius thrust into the earth, his hands clenched until they bled. He remembered every nod she had given him in the camp, every fleeting smile between battles. Now, all of it was ash. He saw Rome, the city he had sworn his blood to, not only betraying itself, but robbing him of the last precious thing he had. In despair, Marcus lifted his eyes to the golden eagle planted in the camp. Its wings still gleamed, still a symbol of power, but in his sight, the light was cold, distant. It was no longer the dream of his youth, but the thief of the most fragile piece of his soul. From that night, Marcus changed. His heart hardened, his face set like iron. Love had been severed, leaving behind a warrior who no longer feared but who had no room left for gentleness. In the smoke and fire of civil war, a new Marcus was born, not only the sword of Rome, but the shadow he now carried within. The Aegean Sea stretched vast and endless, waves crashing violently beneath a sky heavy with clouds. That year, the fate of the entire empire would be decided at Actium, where two Roman powers faced each other. Octavian, who called himself the savior of the Republic, and Antonius with Queen Cleopatra, the symbol of Eastern power. Legions, fleets, supplies all converged upon that narrow sea. Marcus, now a hardened centurion, was ordered to command a unit of soldiers on a warship. His heart had turned to stone after Aelia's death, but deep inside, he understood this battle was more than a struggle for a throne. It was Rome's final destiny. Beneath the shadow of the sails billowing in the wind, he looked up at the golden eagle fixed to the prow, whispering to himself, "If I must die, I will die here, to carve my name into the sea." The day of decision came. At dawn, Antonius and Cleopatra's fleet stretched like a forest of sails, while Octavian's ships lined up in tight formation, their prows armed with sharp iron rams. The horns blared, thunder rolling across the waters. The Battle of Actium had begun. Marcus's ship surged forward, oars churning the sea. Arrows and flaming stones from catapults rained down, striking the water and bursting into plumes of smoke. When ships collided, the crash of splintering wood, the clash of steel, the screams of soldiers, all rose into a chorus of death. Marcus led his men as they leapt onto the enemy vessel, shields high, gladius striking in the storm of spears. Blood sprayed across the wooden decks, the waves dyed red. Marcus cut one enemy down, then spun to shield a comrade from a blow. Above, smoke and fire swirled as gulls scattered in terrified flocks. The battle turned the sea into a vast inferno. In the chaos, Marcus saw Antonius's banner falling back, and the Egyptian ships of Cleopatra turning sails in retreat. The sight pierced the soldiers like a dagger, their leaders fleeing, the ranks collapsing. Shouts of "Betrayal! Betrayal!" thundered louder than the waves. Marcus roared to hold the line, but the tide of panic dragged everything apart. His ship was surrounded by 3 enemy vessels. Iron rams smashed into the hull, wood shattered, water pouring in. Soldiers panicked, but Marcus still stood, eyes blazing like fire. He shouted, "Rome does not die. As long as the eagle stands, we live." The cry lit flames in frightened hearts. His unit formed a circle, shields locked, blocking every strike. Marcus struck down more foes, though blood covered his armor. When a spear pierced his shoulder, he still roared like a lion. Every blow of his sword was a vow for Aelia, for his parents, for Latium, for everything he had lost. At last, as the ship broke apart and waves surged in, Marcus was hurled into the sea. The freezing water closed around him, but in that final moment, he still saw above him the golden eagle on the Roman ship, wings blazing through fire and smoke, unbroken. That image burned into his eyes before the sea swallowed all. The Battle of Actium ended with the defeat of Antonius and Cleopatra, opening the new reign of Octavian, the first Caesar Augustus. But for Marcus, that battle was the final toll, where he gave all his blood and bone. In the crimson waves, he merged into Rome's immortal epic, not written only in victory, but in the tragedy of nameless soldiers. After Actium, Octavian's fleet stood victorious, while the names of Antonius and Cleopatra sank into the abyss of history. But among the wreckage of ships and the sea of blood, the body of Marcus Valerius Severus was never found. People only remembered that he fought until the final moment when the ship broke apart. When the waves swallowed him, he was still shouting his vow to Rome. News reached Latium. His parents wept until no tears remained. yet in their eyes still flickered a quiet pride. They knew their son had not died as an unknown captive, but had merged into legend. In Rome, during the rites for the unknown soldiers, someone spoke Marcus's name in prayer. Severus, son of Latium, who gave himself to the eagle. No statue, no gravestone, only a story carried from soldier to soldier, from one generation to the next. Some claimed that on stormy nights, when the Aegean roared, if you listened closely you could hear the cry of Roma, rising from the depths, as if Marcus's spirit still fought beneath the waves. Others swore they had seen the figure of an armoured warrior standing upon the foam, eyes burning like stars, gladius in hand, never falling. For Rome, Marcus was not a great general, nor did he leave behind monuments or decrees. But in the hearts of the soldiers, he was the embodiment of what the Romans called virtus, the virtue of a man, courage, loyalty, and endurance before fate. He did not fight for a throne, but to uphold his vow, even though Rome itself had taken from him everything he held most dear. When Octavian became Augustus, he ordered a small monument raised by the Tiber to honour the soldiers who had fallen in the civil wars. No one knew if Marcus's name was carved there, but the people of Latium whispered, "Within those stones flows the blood of Severus." Time passed, and the Roman Empire continued to expand, conquering to the four corners of the world. New generations of soldiers, before stepping onto the battlefield, still told the tale of the poor shepherd boy who became an unyielding warrior. They called him by many names: the son of Latium, the ghost of Actium, or simply Severus. In the memory of Rome, he did not die. He became part of the immortal instinct the Romans cherished: to live in order to fight, to die in order to be eternal in the common song. For an empire may fall, emperors may be forgotten, but the names of soldiers like Marcus will echo forever, like the eternal footsteps of the legions marching along the stone roads back to Rome. And so it was, that in the whisper of wind through the arenas, in the crashing waves along the Tiber's banks, people still heard the ancient vow resound: Rome does not die. As long as the eagle stands, we live. Marcus Valerius Severus, more than a man, he was an endless note in the epic song of Rome.